In 1978, a woman paid almost nothing for a piece of land that no one else wanted. It was a small island off the coast of Scotland, empty, wind-battered, written off by everyone who had ever lived there. The locals said it was cursed with bad soil and worse weather. The last family had left decades earlier, taking their animals and leaving their houses to fall in on themselves. She didn't care. She signed the papers anyway. For years, nobody paid much attention. It was just another forgotten island on a forgotten coastline. Then, 45 years later, something changed. Satellite images started showing green where there used to be gray. Fishermen began reporting strange sightings near the shoreline. A marine biologist studying nearby waters noticed patterns that didn't match any nearby ecosystem. Something had happened on that island, something nobody had planned for. And when researchers finally set foot on the land again, what they found didn't just surprise them. It raised questions nobody in Scotland could answer right away. This is the story of an abandoned island, one woman's decision, and a transformation that took nearly half a century to reveal itself. The island sits 3 miles off the northwest coast of Scotland, in a stretch of water known for sudden storms. Locals call it by an old Gaelic name, one that roughly translates to the forgotten place. Before 1978, only one family had lived there for generations. Sheep farmers, mostly. Hard people, used to hard winters. But the soil was thin. The wind never stopped. And the nearest doctor was a 2-hour boat ride away. One by one, the young people left for the mainland. Then the old ones followed, too tired to keep fighting the land. By the time the last family boarded a ferry for good, the island had no permanent residents at all. For years, it stayed that way. Empty stone cottages, collapsed fences, a small church with no one left to pray in it. Real estate agents on the mainland joked that the island was impossible to sell. Too remote, too harsh, too much work for too little reward. Then a woman from Edinburgh made an offer. She had no farming background, no family ties to the island, just a strange, quiet conviction that the place was worth saving. Neighbors on the mainland thought she was making a mistake. Some said it outright, to her face. "You'll be back within a year," one boat captain told her as he dropped her supplies on the dock. She didn't answer. She just started unloading crates. What she didn't know yet, what nobody knew yet, was that the island had been quietly changing long before she arrived. Something in the soil, something in the water, something that would take decades to fully surface. And once it did, the questions it raised would reach far beyond that small stretch of Scottish coastline. The first few years were brutal. She lived in one repaired cottage, heating it with peat she cut herself. No electricity, no running water, just a generator that failed more often than it worked. Locals on the mainland expected her to give up. Some placed bets on how long she would last. But she didn't leave. Instead, she started doing something strange. She stopped farming the way the old families had. No more sheep grazing every inch of the hillside. No more clearing brush the moment it grew. She let the land go wild. A retired agricultural officer who had worked the region for 30 years called it reckless. He warned her the island would become useless, overtaken by weeds and erosion. She ignored him. Over the next decade, visitors were rare, but the few who did stop by noticed something odd. The hillsides looked different, thicker, greener in places that used to be bare rock and thin grass. One fisherman who had passed the island his whole life said something felt off about it. He couldn't explain what. By the late 1980s, a marine surveyor mapping the coastline noted unusual kelp growth just offshore, denser than anything nearby. He assumed it was a temporary bloom, nothing worth investigating further. Nobody connected it to the island itself, not yet. Meanwhile, on the island, something else was happening. Birds that hadn't been seen in the region for decades started appearing. Then, in 1994, a hiker exploring the coastline for a magazine feature noticed something that made him stop walking entirely. He lowered his binoculars, looked again, and said out loud to no one, "That shouldn't be here." What the hiker saw was a white-tailed eagle gliding low over the cliffs, a bird that had vanished from Scotland decades earlier. Hunted to extinction in the region by the early 1900s. He photographed it, unsure if anyone would believe him. When the images reached a wildlife conservation group on the mainland, the reaction was immediate. A senior conservation officer, who had spent his career tracking reintroduction efforts elsewhere in Scotland, called the sighting impossible without direct human intervention. No official program had released eagles anywhere near that island. So, how did one end up there? The officer arranged a visit. What his team found didn't just answer that question. It opened dozens more. The island's interior, once stripped bare by generations of grazing sheep, was now covered in dense scrub woodland, rowan, birch, thick heather returning across old farmland. Streams that had been dry for decades were running again. One team member, a botanist, described the change as something he'd only seen in long-term rewilding studies elsewhere in Europe. Not something expected from a single person, working alone, without funding or government support. This isn't supposed to happen this fast, he told the officer, standing in a clearing that hadn't existed on any old maps. But the biggest shock wasn't the plants or the birds. It was what they found near the northern cliffs, a series of nests, active, multiplying, far more than one breeding pair could explain. The officer radioed the mainland immediately, requesting emergency survey equipment. Because if the numbers he was seeing were accurate, this wasn't just a recovery story anymore. This was something researchers hadn't documented anywhere else in Scotland, and nobody yet understood why it was happening on this island of all places. The survey team spent 3 days on the island, and every day the numbers grew stranger. Multiple breeding pairs of eagles, nesting sites the officer had never seen concentrated so closely together anywhere in the country. He'd studied reintroduction zones for 15 years. He'd never seen density like this. Then the botanist made a connection that changed everything. He pulled up old agricultural records from the 1970s, comparing them to soil samples taken that week. The original farmland had been heavily grazed for generations, right up until the family left in the 1970s. Overgrazing had stripped nutrients from the soil and left it compacted, nearly lifeless. When the woman stopped all grazing entirely, the land didn't just recover, it transformed. Native seeds, dormant for decades, finally had the chance to grow. Trees returned first, then insects, then small mammals that fed on those insects. Each layer built on the one before it, quietly for over 40 years. By the time the eagles arrived, The island already had everything they needed to thrive: fish-rich waters, undisturbed cliffs, and a food chain rebuilt from the ground up. She didn't create a sanctuary, the officer said, standing at the cliff edge. She just stopped interfering. And the island did the rest. But one detail still didn't sit right with him. Rewilding at this scale, done properly in similar projects across Europe, normally took government funding, active seeding, sometimes decades of managed reintroduction. This had happened with none of that. One person, no support, no official program. He looked down at his notes, then back at the tree line, uneasy. Because if this could happen here quietly, without anyone noticing for 45 years, what else had gone unnoticed on islands just like this one, all along the Scottish coast? The news reached the mainland faster than anyone expected. Conservation groups from across Scotland requested access to the island. Journalists followed soon after. The woman, now in her 70s, was suddenly being asked questions she never expected to answer. Reporters wanted to know her secret. Scientists wanted her methods documented. Government officials wanted to know why no one had studied this sooner. Her answer was simple, and it frustrated almost everyone who heard it. "I didn't do anything special," she said. "I just left it alone." For conservationists studying large-scale rewilding, that answer was almost impossible to accept. Every major recovery effort they knew of required funding, coordination, careful management. This island had none of that. Just decades of quiet, undisturbed time. Researchers now believe the island offers something rare. Real evidence of what happens when land is given full ecological freedom, without human control shaping every outcome. The eagle population continues to grow. Botanists return every year to track the woodland's expansion. What was once dismissed as barren, unusable land is now studied as a model for rewilding projects elsewhere in Europe. The old farming families who once lived there are gone, but something else moved in, slowly, patiently, filling the space they left behind. Today, the island remains largely off-limits to tourists, protected to preserve what has taken nearly half a century to build. The woman still lives there, in the same repaired cottage, watching eagles circle cliffs that were empty when she arrived. What she proved, without meaning to, is that sometimes the most powerful action is inaction. That land, left alone long enough, remembers how to heal itself. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more real stories of nature reclaiming what was lost.